next section from verse 12 onwards concerning the matter of Hannah and her son. And in our study this afternoon, we left Hannah clearly afflicted and distressed by that adversity which beset her. You'll remember that we made the point about her adversity rather than her adversary, that it strangely happened at the sanctuary. And you might just remember what the context of that was. Do you see verse 4? It's when Elkanah gave portions of the peace offering at the sanctuary for his family to share in the fellowship meal. It's the time when he gives to Hannah, verse 5, a portion for 2 faces at the sanctuary to share the fellowship meal. It's when that occurs that her adversity also provokes her sore, verse 6. And when is it? When she went up, verse 7, to the house of God. That's where the provocation occurs, says the record. So whatever we make of this interpretation of adversary versus adversity, we have to see it and explain it in the context of the fact that it was happening at the sanctuary, at the yearly cycle. And for that reason, we believe that it is a better explanation to see that the word is translated as it ought to be, as adversity, which enriches our understanding now, because Hannah was the type of person that was never focused on the individual wrong done to her by some other individual person, however unpleasant it might have been. Her mind was focused on a much wider cause, the cause of the nation itself. And as we said, that trial that she had therefore, we don't think it related directly to Peninnah, or even to the fact that she was herself childless. She was worried about the nation. And that concern emanated from a woman whose mind was always focused on higher things. And what we discovered, you'll remember, is that in the depth of her distress, she did the right thing. Because what did she do? She came before God. She came before God in repeated and earnest prayer, because that was an indispensable part of Hannah's life. And I think one of the lessons that we did learn and should learn is that prayer, you see, brings everything into perspective. Because it compels us to view our trials through the lens of God's purpose. That before we even think about seeking his involvement in a matter, we must first have tried to understand what his objective might be. Prayer is such a wonderful thing because it forces us, compels us to see the whole thing from the divine standpoint. And that's what it meant to Hannah, to be the handmaid of the highest. It meant that as his instrument, she sought to do what was consistent with her master's purpose, not her own. And so she came and she offered that remarkable petition in verse 11 that revealed all her heart and soul and mind. And now the record says in the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 verse 12, and it came to pass as she continued praying before Yahweh. The margin says she multiplied to pray. Green's literal says she prayed long. And Eli noticed. Well, he probably noticed because it was probably quite unusual to see anyone praying at the temple in those days. And this woman didn't just pray. She prayed and prayed and prayed. Now, have we ever prayed ourselves for the needs of the ecclesia, or for the guidance of our family, or for the hand of Yahweh upon our own labours? I dare say we've all prayed such prayers, and so we should have. Question: how long do we pray for? 2 minutes? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 20 minutes? See, we don't pray that long, do we? We just don't pray that long because we would struggle to do it, because the very act of prayer is spiritually exhausting, because proper prayer, earnest prayer, involves so much when you think about it. It involves focusing our mind, expressing our thoughts, confessing our need, seeking his help, declaring his righteousness, pleading his response, accepting his will. Fervent prayer is spiritually demanding. So there's a lesson here. the only people who can continue long in prayer are those who are practiced in prayer. And Hannah was. So this wasn't the first time she'd prayed that long. How she prayed at the house of God was no doubt how she prayed the same way back at her house in Ramah. She knew how to multiply prayer so that time sped away while she was lost in contact with her God, which incidentally was the very fellowship she'd been seeking and couldn't find at the fellowship meal, but she found it now as she drew close to her God in prayer. She multiplied to pray. Could we do that, brothers and sisters? I'm not sure that we've got her focus. I'm not sure we've got her intensity. We're told of an occasion, are we not, in the 1st of Samuel chapter 15 verse 11, when Samuel cried unto God in prayer, says the record, all night. Now, where did he learn the secret of praying and praying with such intensity? Why, from his mother. Her prayers he had first heard while he was still in the womb. Whatever spirit of priestly intercession Samuel would later show, he had it as a spiritual gift from his mother. So maybe that is a lesson for mothers. Mothers, your household prayers and the spirit with which they are given is part of the legacy that you will imprint upon your children. Never underestimate the power of those prayers. Now, the thing that Eli noticed in particular was Hannah's mouth. See what the record says, verse 12? Eli marked her mouth, it says. And the next verse goes on to tell us what it was that he noticed, because verse 13 says, well, you see, Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. So she spake in her heart means, of course, that she spake with herself. Her prayer was absolutely intense, her lips moved, and yet for all of that it was completely private. Her voice was not heard. So in Hannah's prayer there was no ostentatious display of learned recitation. There was no dramatic show of open lament. Her prayer was offered in grief, but it was still private. And therefore Eli, who couldn't make sense of what it was that he was looking at and what it was that he was seeing, unaccustomed to receiving godly believers at the temple who might offer godly prayers, well, he completely misunderstood the situation. And so we're told, he says in this verse, Eli said unto her, how long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee, says verse 14. So he was quick to rebuke what he took to be drunken behaviour. But you realise why he probably said that. He evidently had had to contend with such problems before at the sanctuary. Even women were turning up drunk at the temple. And you wonder whether the priesthood was corrupt in these days? So he says, put away thy wine. And what he's really saying is, you go away and sleep your wine off. You shouldn't be here. It reminds us of those words in the 1st of Samuel 25, verse 37, when it says, and in the morning when the wine was gone out of Nabal. Do you remember that expression? I think that's exactly what Eli is saying to Hannah here. He says, you're drunk, woman. Get off home. You sleep it off. Don't let me see you till the morning. And if ever there was an indication that Hannah was all alone, it was, well, right here. She's at the sanctuary of God. And two men had absolutely failed her in her time of need. Elkanah had sought to comfort her, but he did not understand the reason for her sorrow. Eli had sought to rebuke her, but he did not understand the purity of her prayer. Hannah was all alone. And that was a state that many a godly person from time to time will find themselves in. But just look at her spirit of response when this man said to her, how long wilt thou be drunken? Verse 15, Hannah's answer. She said, no, my Lord. Oh, do you notice her immense respect for Yahweh's anointed priest? No, my Lord, she says. Now you stop and think about the implications of those words in verse 15. She knew that this man's weakness had led to the evil of his sons. She knew that this man was responsible for a corrupt priesthood. She knew that this man was the cause of the nation's ruptured fellowship with God, and yet such was her reverence and respect for the office of the high priest that she still called him Lord. "No, my Lord," she says, "I'm a woman of sorrowful spirit." One translation says pained in spirit. Another translation says deeply troubled. And the sorrow of that pain and the anguish of that trouble had caused her on this occasion to pour out her soul before Yahweh with such intensity that her body swayed and her lips moved. But none of this was because she was drunken, as Eli had supposed. But the interesting thing, is that in replying to him in verse 15, she doesn't use Eli's word for drunken at all. She answers him, but she doesn't use his word. In fact, her reply was not just a repudiation of his charge, it was a scriptural testimony which Eli, of all people, should have immediately understood. "No, my Lord," she says, "I'm a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink." Now, where do those words come from? "What thinkest thou?" And of course the answer is it's the Nazarite vow, isn't it? The law of the Nazarite. Now come back and have a look at it because it's highly relevant to our study. In Numbers chapter 6 verses 1 to 5, the law of the Nazarite is precisely what Hannah was drawing attention to here in her reply to Eli denying her state of inebriation. So this is what it says in Numbers 6 verse 1. It says, "Yahweh spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When either man or woman shall separate themselves to vow a vow of a Nazarite to separate themselves unto Yahweh, he shall separate from wine and strong drink, and shall drink no vinegar of wine, nor vinegar of strong drink, neither shall he drink any liquor of grapes, nor eat moist grapes or dried. All the days of his separation shall he eat nothing that's made of the vine tree from the kernels even to the husk. All the days of the vow of his separation there shall no razor come upon his head until the days be fulfilled in the which he separates himself unto Yahweh. He shall be holy and shall let the locks of the hair of his head grow." And this is the reference, of course, to the strong wine or wine and strong drink that Hannah's making allusion to here in her answer to Eli. Because you see, just like the peace offering, the law of the Nazarite, did you notice verse 2, permitted either a man or a woman to make such a vow of dedication. And Hannah was claiming that right in her own life. That's part of what she's saying to Eli. Now, let me show you how that vow ends, because it's rather wonderful. In Numbers 6 verse 18, here's the completion of the Nazarite vow when it came to the triumphant climax of one who had successfully completed their vow period. Verse 18 says, "And the Nazarite shall shave the head of his separation at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and shall take the hair of the head of his separation and put it in the fire which is under the sacrifice of the peace offerings. And the priest shall take the sodden shoulder of the ram and one unleavened cake out of the basket and one unleavened wafer, and shall put them upon the hands of the Nazarite after the hair of his separation is shaven. And the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before Yahweh. This is holy for the priest, with the wave breast and the heave shoulder. And after that, the Nazarite may drink wine." So you realise, brothers and sisters, that what happened at the end of the vow was, firstly, the hair that had been shaved off was thrown under the offering that it might flame up in a blaze at the completion of this sacrifice. And then on the hands of the Nazarite were placed the portions of the peace offering which really belonged to the priest. But that priest now invited the Nazarite to share that offering with him, and together they waved the portion before Yahweh and entered into fellowship with God together, Nazarite and priest. Can you just imagine Hannah yearning for that? That was her whole spirit and desire. And her statement that she had neither drunk wine nor strong drink not only showed that Eli was completely wrong in his assessment of her, but that she was already on that course of abstention which the Nazirite vow required. But here's the thing. You see, that separation from wine and strong drink was associated with mental clarity, and Hannah's use of the same terms indicated that she's got the Nazirite vow in mind. But she's not referring, is she, to the Nazirite dedication of her son that might be born. No, she's not referring to the Nazirite dedication of he who will be called Samuel. Such was her spirit that even in her distress, her response was to pledge an even higher commitment in her own life. She'd already pledged her son's life should he be born, but this vow of Nazirite dedication is for herself. She's talking about a vow for herself. And there was there not, an immediate and recent case which Hannah was absolutely aware of and to which she was also referring. And that case concerned the mother of Samson. So if you come to the book of Judges in chapter 13, because you might remember in our opening study, we made the point that the story of Samson is the last story in the book of Judges, and the story of Samuel is the first story in the book of 1 Samuel, and those two stories are very close together in time, perhaps closer than we might have realized. So here we've got it in Judges chapter 13, verses 2 to 5, these words, which I think Hannah was well aware of this story and this matter. There was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and bare not. And the angel of Yahweh appeared unto the woman and said unto her, Behold, now thou art barren and bearest not, but thou shalt conceive and bear a son. Now therefore beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite unto God from the womb. And now verse 7. And he said unto me, Behold, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and now drink no wine nor strong drink, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb to the day of his death. What was the vow of the Nazirite here? From the womb to the day of death. What was the vow that Hannah made concerning her child? I will give him unto Yahweh all the days of his life. And now verses 13 and 14 of Judges 13. And the angel of Yahweh said unto Manoah, Of all that I said unto the woman, let her beware, that she may not eat of anything that cometh of the vine, neither let her drink wine nor strong drink, or eat any unclean thing. And all that I commanded her, let her also observe. So here's another Nazirite dedication of a child and a woman who's involved with this. But you see, unlike Manoah's wife, Hannah needed no admonition from an angel to abstain from wine and strong drink. She didn't need an angel to command her to do so. She made that commitment in that voluntary spirit, which was the very heart of the Nazirite vow itself, without compulsion and of her own free will. She's already made that commitment in her life. And this is what she says to Eli in response to his misjudgment in chapter 1 of Samuel and verse 14 about putting away wine. And so she utters those words in the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 and verse 15 in response to him, drawing his attention both to the Nazirite vow and perhaps to something that that Eli also would have been aware of in the matter of the birth of Samson not so long ago. So the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 verse 16 says, Hannah says to Eli, Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial. Rotherham says, Do not count thine handmaid for an abandoned woman. You see, Eli had completely misinterpreted her actions, and he'd also misread her motives. As the high priest, he was supposed to have compassion on those in need, but he'd failed Hannah at this moment. And how perverse, when you think about it, was this estimate? Because Hannah asked him not to consider her as a daughter of Belial, when the divine estimate of his own boys was that they were sons of Belial, as chapter 2 verse 12 tells us. So the man who criticised Hannah had children who were the very embodiment of the evil which he thought he'd seen a glimpse of in Hannah's impassioned prayer. Don't count thy handmaid as a daughter of Belial, and this to a man whose own boys were the sons of Belial. There was something wrong here, wasn't there, brothers and sisters? And so she says, verse 16, out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. And that word grief, incidentally, here in verse 16 is the same word translated provoked her sore back in verse 6. Her grief related to her adversity, and it was the same grief that God himself felt at the wickedness of his people. Well, do you know, I think that when Hannah said what she said here to Eli in verse 15 and verse 16, I do think that Eli was clearly impressed with Hannah's response. And I think we can assume that he'd heard her well enough to know that she was quoting from Numbers 6 and the law of the Nazarite. Because she says to him, and refers to Numbers 6, and he now says to her, verse 17, Eli answered and said, go in peace. But that's interesting, isn't it? Because do you remember that the chapter on the Nazarite law concluded with the priestly benediction? Numbers 6, verses 24 to 26. Yahweh bless thee and keep thee. Yahweh make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. And Eli said, go in peace. And that word peace in Numbers 6 stood related to the peace offering, the final fellowship joy of the peace offering, the one thing that Hannah couldn't reach, the one thing that Hannah couldn't find. And in that beautiful blessing of dismissal, Eli told Hannah that he understood all her heart. I've heard you. I understand, said the old man, go in peace. And he also implied that he would reach that moment of peace when the God of Israel so decreed, as he goes on to say, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. Literally in the Hebrew, the asking that you asked. Now, I don't think, incidentally, that Eli's words were a prediction. I think they were his statement of support for the woman who stood before him, that God might grant a favourable response to her entreaty. May Yahweh do this unto thee, he says. May Yahweh bring about those things that you have been upset about and gone to him in prayer for. May Yahweh grant thy petition. Do you know, brothers and sisters, Eli had no idea at that moment how revolutionary Hannah would be in the nation that he was the high priest of. Her cries unto God bore a direct relation to the destiny of his own family. He had no idea of the change that Hannah would set in train, a spirit of change that would reach out to overthrow his own household, especially his evil sons. He had no realization of what this woman was about, but Hannah did. And yet this is what she said in response to his priestly blessing. Verse 18, let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. Now, do you notice again her absolute respect for Eli's place as Yahweh's appointed priest? That term handmaid was the expression that she'd used in addressing God himself in the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 verse 11. But Eli, as high priest, was still, from Hannah's perspective, the representative of God. And so she uses the same expression in addressing him. She says, let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. So here's the thing. She stood opposed to all that Eli had done. But she never lost her spirit of respect for the office of the priesthood, and she hoped to play a part in restoring its dignity. Do you know, brothers and sisters, we ought never to lose respect for the offices of ecclesial life, for the duties and offices of ecclesial life. Even in times and in matters where we might respectfully disagree. There is never ever grounds for open criticism of arranging brethren and the debasing of them for no other reason than a person in the congregation disagrees and has another view. You're entitled to another view. You're not entitled to disrespect the office. And Hannah didn't, when she had perhaps every reason to do so. So, verse 18, and she said, let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. So the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. So here's a marvellous example of how prayer settles the heart and the mind. You see, she hasn't received an answer from God yet. She's only just committed the matter to him, and she rested in that. You see, there's a tremendous difference between grief that we haven't brought to God and grief that we have brought to him. And although outwardly her circumstances, well, they hadn't changed, she was now joyous and resolute. She was full of assurance that her prayer would be answered. It was a different Hannah who returned to the family, a woman made tranquil and serene, a woman prepared in heart now to eat in peace, in fellowship with God, and made whole in partaking of her portion. Go in peace, Eli had said, and she went her way. It was as if the spirit of this passage rested upon her. Ecclesiastes 9, verse 7. Go thy way, eat thy bread with joy, and drink thy wine with a merry heart, for God now accepteth thy works. And so she did go back, and she did eat bread. But notice carefully, verse 18, that the record never says, unlike verse 9, that she did drink. She ate bread, but she drank no wine. Her vow of Naziriteship for her son extended to a Nazirite vow upon herself, that not only in his life, but even in his conception and his bearing in her womb, he would be an holy child. And even in her newfound peace, that vow would stand, must stand, as she awaited the day of Yahweh's visitation in her life. She's a changed woman. She's brought her grief to the Father in prayer, and it's altered her. But there was a problem. And the problem was this, that the law of Moses made express provision that everything she had vowed might be set aside by her husband if he did not endorse it. And when you think about it, her vow was rather unusual. I'd like to have a son, and then I'd like to give the son away. And it's not just my son, it's Elkanah's son. So how do you think Elkanah would handle that request or that suggestion? He might be very doubtful about the wisdom of the whole matter. So would he endorse her vow, or would he disannul? Would he permit, or would he disallow? Well, that problem needed to be resolved, don't you think? In fact, immediately. And I think we can infer from this record exactly how Hannah went about it. So verse 19 says, they rose up early in the morning, and in the morning early, and worshipped before Yahweh, and returned. So the thing is, you see, that although the family made an early start, they made a point of attending the sanctuary for a final act of worship before going home. So here we've got an age of overwhelming wickedness, and yet this family showed outstanding dedication to the truth. Elkanah was a man of faith. And I think we can assume, when these words are written in verse 19, that Hannah must have been a joyful participant, don't you think, on that next morning as they went back to the sanctuary. There was something changed in her demeanour. In fact, I think that change from her time in the sanctuary probably was noticed by Elkanah, either at the sanctuary or certainly on the way home. There was going to have to be discussion between these two, because Elkanah saw there's something different about Hannah, and we're going to need to talk about that. What has gone on? What has happened? Now the question arises, therefore, should Hannah have made such a vow without Elkanah's knowledge? And I think that part of the answer lay in the divine counsel that permitted any man or woman to bring a peace offering, permitted any man or woman to make a Nazirite pledge, and which allowed any man or woman to bind their soul with a vow. Men and women are equal in their capacity to love the truth, to worship God, to draw near before him in fervent prayer, to ascend into the holiest, to find fellowship with the Almighty. There is no constraint in that sense upon a sister that prevents her from exercising her deepest spiritual faculties in the truth. But there were mutual responsibilities within the marriage bond, and Hannah knew that she must talk with Elkanah eventually to share her vow and seek his endorsement. Well, that brings us to the law of vows. So let's come back and have a look at that. It's in Numbers chapter 30. And again, it's highly relevant to our understanding of this passage, we believe, in the book of 1st of Samuel chapter 1. So the law of vows in Numbers chapter 30 says thus, reading from the first verse. And Moses, it says, spake unto the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel, saying, This is the thing which Yahweh hath commanded. If a man vow a vow unto Yahweh, or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. And if a woman also vow a vow unto Yahweh, and bind herself by a bond. So the law permitted either a man or a woman to decide whether they might bind themselves with a vow. In the case, though, of a wife, the husband needed to confirm it, but I want you to notice what the law said. It stated that the responsibility of the husband was either to hold his peace and thereby establish the vow, or to disallow and therefore make void the vow. But when was he responsible for doing that? Well, the book of Numbers 30 says, not from the day she uttered the vow, but from the day he heard it. Now, do you see this? Verse 7. Her husband heard it and held his peace at her in the day he heard it. Verse 8. If her husband disallow her on the day that he heard it. Verse 12. If her husband hath utterly made them void on the day he heard them. Verse 14, if her husband altogether hold his peace at her from day to day, then he establisheth all her vows or all her bonds which are upon her, because he confirmeth them, because he held his peace at her in the day that he heard them. Verse 15, in the day after that he heard them, then he will be responsible for what he's done or not done. So not from the day she uttered a vow, but from the day he heard it. In fact, the very words in verse 13 about every vow and binding oath to afflict the soul, well, wasn't that the very circumstances of Hannah in the 1st of Samuel chapter 1, verses 10 and 11? She was in bitterness of soul and said, Look on the affliction of thy handmaid. So here in this chapter, the word stand, verse 11, her vows shall stand. And again in verse 12, they shall not stand. And the word establish in verse 13, her husband may establish it. And again in verse 14, then he establisheth all her vows. And the word confirmeth in verse 14 are all the same Hebrew word. Her vows shall stand, her vows shall be confirmed, her vows shall be established, all the same word. So whether her vow would be confirmed or denied still rested with her husband, irrespective of when she originally made it. She was entitled to do that, but she would have to subject herself to the process of this discussion with her husband. And yet we believe that Hannah was at peace. The woman who arrived in Shiloh was distressed and afflicted. She offered prayer and came to a state of peace. But it would have been very easy, don't you think, for Hannah to become distressed all over again as they started on the journey home. Because you think, oh, we've got to take this walk, we've got to come home, and when we get home, I'm going to have to explain all this to Elkanah. We've got to go through the whole matter of the law of vows in Numbers 30, and I'm not sure whether he's going to disallow, whether he's going to allow it, and I don't know how this is going to go. I'm all worried about how this is going to work out. It would be so easy for Hannah to have got distressed all over again, don't you think? Oh, yes, I think so. But that was not the Hannah who returned home. I think she was at peace. That's what Eli had told her, go in peace. And I think she did. The question is, why was she so settled in her mind? We'll come back to the record, 1st of Samuel now, and the matter of the vow. And let's see what happens in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 19. So it says, they rose up early in the morning, worshipped before Yahweh, returned, and came to their house, to Ramah. And I think that the Hannah that arrived home was in a state of peace for this reason. Because she knew that if God could hear her, and if God could give her a son, then couldn't he also work a work with her husband? Couldn't he convince Elkanah of the spirit and importance of her vow? And the answer is, of course God could. And Hannah realized that now. She placed the matter in Yahweh's hands. She no longer needed to worry about it. If God was going to give her the son, then he would work a work for Elkanah to approve her vow. That's what it means to take our problems to the Father in prayer. We truly give it to him. We ask him to provide the answer. And that's one of the most amazing benefits of what happens when in the despair of our most anguished prayers, we finally surrender to God. Finally, we surrender to him and learn to cast all our cares upon him. And she knew that if her purpose in seeking a man-child was consistent with the divine will, then all else would follow. It was all okay. So, of course, the question is, the burning question is, don't you think, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 19, when do you think she spoke with Elkanah about the vow? Well, the answer is clearly before the matter recorded in the next phrase. And it says, they returned to their house to Ramah, and Elkanah knew Hannah his wife. Well, she must have spoken with Elkanah before this moment, mustn't she? After all, there were huge implications. This child, should there be one, was pledged to God. Do you think it might be helpful for Elkanah to know that? I think so. Even the child's conception needed to occur within the sacredness of a couple who were completely united in their understanding and committed together as to their intention of what would happen if a son was born. She had to tell him now. She absolutely had to tell him now. There was no way she could tell him of her vow after the child was conceived, could she? Even their union needed to be sanctified by a vow that was shared and then a prayer offered together for Yahweh's blessing to rest upon them. And here's the thing. Eli couldn't just permit Hannah's vow to stand. He needed to join it. He needed to make her vow his vow. And the record says Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and Yahweh remembered her. Yahweh remembered his handmaid. Of course, the thing is, he'd never forgotten her, but he was simply waiting for that moment of opportunity that was consistent with his own purpose. And part of that purpose related to timing. You see, God knew what the timetable was. He knew when Samuel needed to be ready to fulfill his role in Israel. He knew when the child needed to be taken to Shiloh, and he knew when that child needed to be conceived. Hannah needed to learn to work with God's timetable and not the other way around. And so do we all, brothers and sisters. So do we all. And so verse 20 says, wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come, about after Hannah had conceived. Now, you see that word time there in verse 20. It's the word yom, Y-O-W-M, and it's the common word, Hebrew word, for day. But it is also translated year. It's translated that way in Exodus 13, verse 10, Leviticus 25, verse 29. And more importantly, it will be translated year in these two chapters, which we'll come to in a moment. And the word come about here, when it says in verse 20, when the time was come about, it is the Hebrew word tekufa, which means a circuit of time or space, some form of circuit. And given that Hannah was about to conceive and bear a son, it could be argued that the circuit of time here related to the cycle of gestation. But it was also true that this family measured their spiritual lives by the circuit of their yearly pilgrimage for sacrifice. And the word for time here is the very word used throughout this whole passage to describe that circuit. You see it back in verse 3, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 3. This man went up out of his city, yearly to worship. From year to year, that's the same word yom. In the cycle of the years was when their worship took place. Again in verse 21, we will come to it shortly, the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto Yahweh the yearly sacrifice. And again in chapter 2, verse 19, the record will say they came from year to year when they came up to offer the yearly sacrifice. So I think that the circuit that's being spoken about, that came to pass in the circuit of time, in the 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 20, was the circuit of their visits to Shiloh. That's the same word, you see. It's the year, the cycle of that year. And if that was so, then what happened was this. Hannah went up to Shiloh. She poured out her complaint before God. She returned home to Ramah in peace. She shared her vow with her husband. She then conceived a child who was born exactly 1 year after their previous visit to Shiloh. And her life was forever transformed. Oh, and if Samuel was born on the anniversary of their previous visit to Shiloh, then they had been home for 3 months before she conceived. 3 months in which to raise the whole matter with Elkanah, to reach a unity of mind, to share a mutual vow, and all this before conception ever took place. I think that's what happened, brothers and sisters. I think the timing fits in with what we would expect to have happened. And so the record says that that child was born within that circuit of time. And it goes on to say, verse 20, that when Hannah conceived, she bare a son and called his name Samuel, saying, because I've asked him of Yahweh. Now, we need to read the record carefully, because it says that Hannah named the child. Did you notice that? Hannah named the child. Now, it wasn't altogether unusual for a woman to name a child. In Genesis chapter 29, Leah names Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah. In Genesis 30, Rachel names Dan. In Genesis 38, Shua names Onan. In 1 Chronicles 7, Maacah named Peresh. So it's not without precedent for a woman to name a child. But the question of the 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 20 is, why didn't Elkanah name him? After all, this was just as much his firstborn son with Hannah, and he's fully involved with their vow. So why didn't he name him? Well, I suggest, brothers and sisters, that just as Hannah trusted him enough to leave to him the approval of her pledge, so he loved his wife well enough to leave to her the naming of their child. What a wonderful couple they were. What a wonderful husband and wife they were. And since no name was ordained of God, there really was a choice, any choice. And I think Hannah completely justified Elkanah's confidence in her, because the name she chose, Samuel, was selected with special care. Now, the margin says it means asked of God, and it doesn't mean asked of God. You see, Samuel's name did not commemorate that Hannah had offered her prayer, although of course she had. Samuel's name commemorates the fact that Yahweh had answered her prayer. He was conceived and born as a result of answered prayer, and therefore he was called, which is what Samuel really does mean, heard of God. It's because I've asked him, but the real point of the birth of the child was that Yahweh heard my asking and has granted that request. And I don't think, brothers and sisters, despite that, I don't think that was the main reason why she chose the name at all. You see, I think that Hannah was always thinking beyond the measure of her own life and even beyond her own joy. And I think a far deeper purpose ran behind that name. Or it was true that her prayer had secured the response of heaven. But Samuel wasn't named Samuel to celebrate her role. She named the child Samuel to celebrate his role. She desired him to be heard of God because he was marked out for priestly intercession, and her faith in naming him thus was vindicated because Samuel became famous for his prayers to God for the nation and for the fact that God heard him. 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 9 says, "And Samuel cried unto Yahweh for Israel, and Yahweh heard him." Psalm 99 verse 6 says, "Moses and Aaron among his priests, and Samuel among them that called upon his name. They called upon Yahweh, and he answered them." Never had a child been better named in anticipation of his destiny, and never had a mother been more deeply aware of her son's destiny than Hannah. But then her mind was always focused on higher things. And so verse 21 says, "And the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto Yahweh the yearly sacrifice." So Elkanah was careful to let nothing hinder the fulfillment of his commitment to Shiloh in going there. The normal yearly cycle of their family pilgrimage would continue. But do you notice the words that follow? It says he went up to do that, to the yearly sacrifice, and to offer his vow. His vow. Now, what was his vow? Well, we're not told. But the sudden introduction of this piece of information on the occasion of his first visit to Shiloh, immediately after the birth of Samuel, tells us that his vow was connected in some way with that child. I think we might reasonably infer that his vow related to a special thanksgiving for the safe arrival of their son. But the really important thing here is this, that you see Elkanah hadn't just entered into compact with Hannah to endorse her vow. He'd added his own vow to the same end. This couple were united, absolutely united concerning the destiny of their son. And now they've both made vow concerning him, that he will be given back to God. Elkanah's part of this now. He's fully involved, fully committed. He went up with his vow on this particular matter. But, says verse 22, "But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned." And so given that Hannah, as we know, had a similar spirit, a similar earnestness as Elkanah in keeping their yearly cycle at Shiloh, her decision not to go was clearly a departure from her normal, probably her desired routine. She would have gone there if she could. You know, it's been suggested by some that Hannah used the matter of weaning to delay the transfer of Samuel to Shiloh, so that she could spend some more time with him herself. That there was a certain selfish aspect or element to her decision that sort of put off the giving of the child for just a little longer. But I think when we read the record of this verse, that the record doesn't support that view at all. Because what Hannah says is, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before Yahweh, and there abide forever. So in fact, her words lead to exactly the opposite conclusion concerning her motives and her thinking at this point. So why did she say what she said, that she'd not bring the boy until he was weaned? I think, incidentally, that's the absolute proof of her commitment to fulfill her vow and not to set it aside. Here's an interesting reference. In Leviticus 22 verse 27 it says, "When a bullock or a sheep or a goat is brought forth, then it shall be 7 days under the dam, and from the 8th day and thenceforth it shall be accepted for an offering made by fire unto Yahweh." So no newborn animal dependent on its mother was to be taken from that mother for sacrifice until 7 days had elapsed. And that period showed kindness to the mother so that she could properly nurse her offspring, but it also allowed the newborn animal to reach a state of independent existence. And both those ideas were going to be true of Hannah and her son. You see, she knew as only a mother could, that until the child was completely independent of her, he could never be Yahweh's. Not in the absolute sense. He's just newborn. He is as yet a sucking child. There's no way she could bring him right now. And she wasn't going to take him up and then take him home and then take him up and then take him home. That would be just terrible. She could only bring him when she could end his dependence on her so that she could walk away and leave him there in Shiloh. So her decision then was not an endeavour to delay or to defer her vow, but the very means by which she would best fulfil it. I want to do this right, says Hannah to Elkanah. I'm only going to take him up once, and that will be the end. When she took him there, that would be the first and last time, and then she would leave him and go. So he had to be weaned. He absolutely had to be weaned so that she could fulfill her vow. And so verse 22 says, at the end of the verse, that when that moment has come, I will bring him that he may appear before Yahweh. So she's absolutely clear in her mind who this child belonged to. Now, she knew that children are an heritage of Yahweh, and she knew what her son's purpose in life would be. And of all those who appeared before Yahweh, the priests were preeminently those who came near before him in their ministration. And it was that work of priesthood she had in mind for her son. I'll bring him that he may appear before Yahweh. You see, from the very outset, she'd pledged him to priestly service. And how long would she leave him there? Verse 22 says, that he might abide there forever, which is really the equivalent to the words of her vow, verse 11, I'll give him unto Yahweh all the days of his life. You see, her commitment to her vow was unwavering, even when she had her firstborn nestled in her arms. She still said, I'll bring him. I'll bring him and leave him there forever. This is an amazing woman, brothers and sisters, and she's certainly a spiritual one. And Elkanah clearly agreed with her in this matter, because verse 23 goes on to say, Elkanah, her husband, said unto her, Do what seemeth thee good, tarry until thou have weaned him. So Elkanah had no hesitation in agreeing with Hannah's decision and her suggestion. He thought his wife had the right to make that decision and accepted that for the journey that he's about to make, that it would be best if she stayed behind. But do you notice a rather interesting expression that he gives at the end of his reply? Because what he said was this. He said, Do what seemeth unto thee good, tarry until thou have weaned him, only Yahweh establish his word. Now that's interesting because, do you know, there's no word of promise spoken by God recorded anywhere in this chapter for him to establish. God doesn't speak a word. So when Elkanah says, may Yahweh establish his word, the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, it could mean, may Yahweh fulfill what he's planned for Samuel and effectively promised by his birth. But the Septuagint has a different translation, and it's one that's worth considering, brothers and sisters, because of the context of this passage. The Septuagint says, may Yahweh establish that which has gone forth out of thy mouth. So in other words, may Yahweh himself, not me, says Elkanah, may Yahweh cause thy vow to be established in your giving the child back to him. In other words, Elkanah's wish was, may Yahweh enable you to fulfill your own vow. May God help you to do that, he says. And I think there are two reasons why that translation might be preferred. The first is that the word establish here, found at the end of verse 23 rather, is the same word found in Numbers 30 verse 14 concerning a husband establishing the vows of his wife. It's the same word. And that takes us straight back to the law of vows, which these two had already discussed together, we believe. And the Septuagint phrase which follows, may Yahweh establish that which is gone forth out of thy mouth, is a direct reference to the same law of vows. Numbers 30 verse 2, if a man vow a vow, he shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. So Elkanah was asking God to establish her vow. May Yahweh establish that which has gone forth out of thy mouth, and to assist Hannah in fulfilling it. Now here's the implication of that reading, brothers and sisters, and it's interesting because the implication of the reading is that this was not just a vow that Hannah and Elkanah shared. God was involved with them in this vow. And I think that Elkanah saw the entire matter as being divinely orchestrated by God who was at work in their lives. So he exhorted Hannah to complete her part so that God in turn might fully accomplish his. There was a wonderful insight that Elkanah showed in this matter. And so the record says, so the woman abode and gave her son suck until she weaned him. You see, from the very beginning, Hannah intended to nurse her child in such a way that her son's direction would be set for life. And in these brief but precious years, he was fed on a rich diet of his mother's milk and his mother's mind, and he absorbed it all. His earliest memories as a child centered on the sound of her voice offering prayers and singing songs. He'd heard them both from the womb. He knew those sounds by heart. By the time he went to Shiloh, the ideas of prayer and praise were already woven into the fabric of the little boy's life. It was a birthright from his mother. He received the imprint of her spirit, and it would remain upon him for a lifetime. That's what good mothers do. They place an imprint of their spirit on their children. It's certainly what Hannah did to hers. And it wasn't just a question of instruction in spiritual principles. She needed to prepare this boy for what was about to come. She needed to prepare him for his dedication. And you know, she could either make the occasion one of sorrow and loss, or one of wonder and joy. It would all depend on her spirit, you see. She could either give him a burden of duty that distressed him, or a sense of destiny that enthralled him. She would choose. But how vital that choice would be. Samuel would never see her pain or feel her sorrow. He'd never sense the price that she would pay in giving him. Instead, he only ever saw his mother's warm courage and her positive spirit and her bright smile that filled him with comfort and certainty that this future that he had at Shiloh must be blessed indeed. And that's what a godly woman does. Never once did her boy know the unutterable pain that she felt in giving him, because his destiny was more important than that. He must never see that. He must only ever see the joy of what lay before him in the purpose of God. And perhaps this verse answers another question, and that question is, how long do you think that Hannah's own vow of Nazirite dedication might have lasted for? Well, we know that she had vowed not to drink wine or strong drink even before she'd conceived the child, so that he could be a Nazirite from the womb. But I wonder whether what she was saying to Elkanah in this verse 23 was that until she had weaned the child, that she herself would remain under that vow. That while Samuel was still dependent on his mother's milk, no wine would pass her lips. And what that would mean, of course, was that from his conception to his weaning and his presentation, her own Nazirite vow would remain in force. You see, as a married woman, she wasn't free to make a lifelong vow. Her duties as a wife would limit her liability and her ability to be dedicated in the way that an unmarried woman might choose. But not for a married woman, but at least for this period she might make vow. So that everything about this child, from conception through gestation, his early nourishment until weaning, was all related to the spirit of separation and holiness. And for her to do that I think was a separate vow that also needed Elkanah's consent. And during that special, precious time, brothers and sisters, she would start to nourish in the child a sense of the destiny that he was marked out to fulfill once he'd got to Shiloh. You know, it's one thing to make a vow in the intensity of a prayer asking for a man-child. It's altogether something else to pay that vow when the little boy stood beside you and the bond of motherhood cried out to keep him. So how did she face that moment? And what was her spirit when the crisis of his giving arrived? And how did she manage her feelings to hold fast to the vow that now, after 4 years, actually needed to be paid? Well, those questions, brothers and sisters, will be the subject of our study tomorrow morning.